Welcome to the Resilience Advantage, a series brought to you by the U.S. Resiliency Council and Optimum Seismic. I'm your host, Evan Reese. In this series, we're exploring what resilience means to the long-term sustainability of our community in the face of natural disasters like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and now even pandemic. In this episode, we'll be taking another look at how disaster resilience policies are driving progress in both the public and private sectors, and how the proper policies can motivate building owners and other stakeholders in the built environment towards longer-term thinking that protects both people and property. Over the past 30 years, there's been a slow but steady trend towards local or state ordinances that require older, vulnerable buildings to be seismically retrofitted. Currently, a number of cities in California are at some point in the process of preparing ordinances regarding the seismic retrofit of older apartment buildings and commercial structures. So now let's look more deeply at what it takes for good disaster policy to be developed, supported, and adopted by the public and private sector. We're calling this Disaster Policy 2.0. Let's frame our conversation around the key elements of resilience. We can do this by describing resilience in terms of 10 INs, I-Ns. The first IN, as it is clearly top of mind in our national conversation, is infrastructure. Recently, President Biden spoke about how the effects of Hurricane Ida were a clarion call that we can't ignore about the potential dangers of natural perils. We have to be thinking different about our infrastructure and build back better. Where what we would characterize as Disaster Policy 1.0 was essentially following the code, ensuring that our buildings provide life safety, Disaster Policy 2.0 would draw on all the lessons we've learned from earthquakes and perils we've experienced in the past, and address the limitations to recovery that existing codes don't address. The second IN goes hand in hand with the first. It's interdependence. Interdependence is a fact of life in modern society. We're all impacted by and depend on others. A disaster in one community or area can easily disrupt life in another. Economic impacts in one sector of our society affect the others. Ryan Kirsting is a licensed California structural engineer who works with Buehler Engineering in Sacramento. He's also the co-chair of the Policy Committee for the Structural Engineers Association of California, or SEOC. The SEOC Policy Committee focuses on legislative activities in California relating not just to the practice of structural engineering, but also public policy that pertains to earthquake risk mitigation. Ryan, tell me, what would a Seismic Policy 2.0 look like to you?
Obviously, at the heart of it, we start to measure our performance not just in terms of safety, but in terms of how quickly we can return to function. So the concept of functional recovery is something we will adapt to. And we're going to talk about that for all sorts of occupancies, whether it's housing, whether it's commercial offices, whether it's retail spaces like grocery stores, schools, whatever it may be. We're going to look at it from a community services perspective and say, we need these sorts of services in this amount of time.
We spoke with Aaron Gross, the Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Los Angeles, at the Great Shakeout press conference we held last October. Aaron spoke about how communities within a region and sectors within each community can build resilience by creating strong bonds of mutual support.
So resilience is really a community effort. We as a city, I as a city, the mayor as a city, can't do it all alone. It really takes partnerships, and resilience really builds on itself. When businesses are able to continue, then they're able to continue to pay taxes to the city, which go towards police and fire and emergency services and fixing the roads. And it really is important when we think about long-term resilience to think about the economic consequences of earthquakes and how that's going to affect not only individuals and families, but how it's going to affect businesses and city and society in general.
We can't speak about the interdependence of our communities without recognizing the need for inclusion. This means that it is essential we leave no one behind when it comes to advocating for resilience policy. In particular, we must consider our vulnerable populations who lack the resources themselves to recover quickly after a disaster, like an earthquake, hurricane, wildfire, or flood. These members of our community, as we have seen over the past year as we've dealt with the COVID pandemic, are vital elements of our workforce, on whom all of us rely to provide some of our most basic and necessary services. Consider how much more devastating to a community it would be if these essential workers, who will be relied upon after a major natural disaster, had no homes to go back to or buildings to work in. These first three INs help us realize that resilience is not something each of us can tackle on our own. It takes the recognition that resilience requires a whole of society approach to make sure that we understand what are the essential functions of a community that allow it to recover quickly after a natural hazard event. Also, how each function depends on and supports others, and how we must make sure that no one is left behind because everyone together makes a community stronger. The next three INs provide the foundation for putting in place policies and objectives that will improve the resilience of our communities and businesses. The first of these is inventories. Taking an inventory of vulnerable buildings is a key first step in understanding a community's exposure to risk. Many communities don't yet fully understand those risks. Amanda Syok runs the earthquake and tsunami programs for FEMA Region 10, which covers Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska.
In order to do a risk assessment for a jurisdiction, you have to look at what hazards you're vulnerable to, and then you overlay your seismic hazard map, for example. Then you want to look at what buildings are vulnerable. And you can also do a building inventory, which is where you're actually looking at, what year were these buildings built? Who occupies these buildings? Using an inventory can help identify what buildings could be more vulnerable based off of the year they were built or what their foundation type is.
Our next IN builds directly on the last, inspection. Inspection and engineering assessments of potentially vulnerable buildings, particularly older structures built before modern building codes were adopted. Engineering inspections help owners determine the extent of their risk and prioritize retrofit programs. Inspections can also help reduce or manage an owner's liability.
First rule of thumb is know your building, know your own building. You need to know if you have an older building, what type of construction that building was made with in its original, when it was originally constructed, and what changes and what improvements have been made over the course of time.
Information is the basis for business leaders, government officials, and the public to make good decisions and investments to protect organizations, communities, and families. Professional associations, elected officials, community organizations, media, and others play important roles in providing information on how best to withstand natural disasters. The key is to translate the science and engineering behind natural hazard risk into meaningful metrics that stakeholders and decision makers can use to raise awareness and support for resilience policy.
There is a disconnect right now from what the public understands and what, let's say, design teams are providing. We know, and this webinar series has certainly highlighted that many times, that there is that disconnect. And so as we did these public workshops as part of the FEMA NIST report and project, we recognized, and that's why some of the recommendations in the report are not just about how we design buildings, but half the recommendations about how we educate the public, how we help them understand the performance they should expect from their buildings. Functional recovery and community resilience is not just something that designers can solve. It's something that engineers, architects, and all the stakeholders really need to be communicating to the public and to the owners and users of these buildings to help them understand what to expect when the next earthquake hits.
The last four INs get at the meat of how to structure policy to accomplish the goal of making our communities more resilient in ways that are affordable and share the costs and benefits among all the stakeholders in the built environment. Let's start with one of my favorite INs, innovation. As a structural engineer for more than 30 years, I'm proud of all that the profession has accomplished in inventing new techniques and products to improve the performance of buildings, particularly in earthquakes, and make the goal of functional recovery possible and practical. In previous episodes, we've highlighted many of the engineering and industry leaders who have developed innovative products and analysis techniques.
There are a lot of good ideas and good practices that have been developed over the years that we rely on to get good performance from our buildings. We can use things like new technologies such as base isolation and passive dampers and implement those into our systems and our structures. And we have innovation in the way we analyze our buildings based on performance-based design, based on higher-end risk assessments, to be able to quantify performance no longer just in terms of how safe it is, but also how it's going to be behaving in terms of repair time and downtime and the costs that are associated with that.
Investment in high-performing new buildings and in retrofits of existing vulnerable buildings ultimately make our built environment safer and protects our economy. The National Institute of Building Sciences found that investments in better-than-code design or in hazard mitigation return between $3 and $13 for every dollar spent, in terms of property and lives protected, and the social and economic preservation of our communities. The good news is that thanks to the previous innovation, achieving resilient performance of our new and existing buildings is both practical and affordable.
We've shown affordable housing projects in downtown San Francisco can be built for higher seismic performance for zero increase in construction cost. We've shown how projects throughout the West Coast for schools, for other institutional facilities can be done for higher seismic performance for 1% or less increase in construction cost. Don't fall into the trap of thinking this higher performance comes with a big price tag.
Camilla Seth is the managing director of the Finance Hub, where her focus has been bringing the tools of commerce and finance in the capital markets to fund and drive environmental change. She described to me how lenders and large financial institutions are thinking more about how investments in resilience now help their own bottom lines when events like earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, and other disasters inevitably happen.
The thing that really changed the perspective of JP Morgan, possibly, was that they were having to swoop in over and over and over and over again. And the numbers of what the relief was costing were starting to become really significant and very hard to manage. And not just the dollars, but the level of effort from the business was becoming really significant. So there was a tipping point when the conversation went from being about relief to preparedness and resilience.
Investment leads us to the next incentives. As the NIB study I mentioned earlier shows, when an owner builds a more resilient building or retrofits a vulnerable structure, stakeholders across the spectrum benefit. Incentives make investments in seismic retrofit or higher performance more affordable for owners of existing buildings and developers of new construction. Incentives include tax credits, loan and grant programs. Incentives could also include expedited permitting, modifications of parking or other regulations.
It's really a basket of different solutions that come together to drive change. And incentives can come in many different forms, and depending on the individual and their situation, different types of incentives work for different people. Tax incentives can work. They can work for developers. Tax incentives can work individually through the IRS with things like disaster savings account.
Incentives was also top of mind for Lori Schumann. She's the Senior Program Director of National Initiatives and Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners.
So the leading tool for construction of affordable housing is the low-income housing tax credit. And it has led to the creation of hundreds of thousands of housing units around the nation. And it's a critical tool that we use to make sure that housing is built and able to be developed.
Colin Diaz, the president and CEO of the Culver City Chamber of Commerce, talked with me about the perspective of the business community in his city.
So it would be important, and I think would behoove the city to work with property owners, to work with businesses and figure out those type of incentive programs, maybe some type of low interest loan that could be taken out to assist in that. I think if the city wanted to, they could look at pooling resources, diverting resources, and look at them from what that would save the city in cost.
In addition to private sector and community level incentives, there are an array of federal grant opportunities available to cities, counties, and tribal entities to support investment in resilient buildings, particularly the mitigation of existing hazards. Congress recently passed the Disaster Response and Recovery Act, which recognized that a lot more money needs to be spent on pre-disaster mitigation. Because if we wait until after the disaster, the cost of recovery will be so much greater. One of the programs established by the new law is BRIC.
So BRIC stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. The BRIC program is an evolution of FEMA's previous pre-disaster mitigation program, or PDM. FEMA did a ton of stakeholder engagement with communities to better understand what barriers they had to applying for and receiving mitigation grant funds. So the BRIC program took all of that feedback and tried to make the grant application and the grant process easier.
The last in we'll discuss is insurance. Insurance protects homeowners and commercial property owners from financial loss from earthquakes and other hazards. Insurance companies actually prefer to insure lower risk properties, and so have their own distinct incentives to help building owners invest in resilience.
Some examples of risk mitigation include physical improvements, such as reinforcement of the structure, so a seismic retrofit. It could be improving building systems, such as bracing sprinkler piping, and installing seismic gas shutoff valves on the natural gas supply lines to the building. It can also be earthquake response planning, especially a business occupancy resumption program, or known as a back to business program. So planning ahead, identifying how your building is going to be inspected following an earthquake and repaired promptly to get back in business as soon as possible.
And as Ben Stapleton of the USGBC-LA pointed out, insurers will benefit long-term when they provide guidance to builders and developers on how to create more resilient structures.
I think for resilience, there needs to be a discussion around, there's a tangible ROI for us to build a resilient asset versus a non-resilient asset. This is an asset that can better withstand earthquakes, that can better withstand the impacts of climate change, that is hardened in the face of fire. There should be financing benefits for that. There should be additional value in the price of that asset because it is better prepared to withstand those challenges and those potential costs and the risk associated with them.
The U.S. Resiliency Council has been actively working in the areas of insurance with brokers, underwriters, and the engineering community to achieve insurance incentives that reward resilience. As we've heard from our guests today, the subject of a new Disaster Resilience Policy 2.0 involves every facet of the subject of resilience and how it affects every part of our community. With every new catastrophe, we are compelled to revisit what could have been done better and try to implement effective change. For better or worse, the need to adjust, adapt, and improve policy has become more urgent than ever. At the U.S. Resiliency Council, we're keeping it front and center, and we're building a coalition of partners to help us do so. With the support of our Resilience Advantage series sponsor, Optimum Seismic, we've made a lot of progress. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and that the 10 Ins of Resilience will help you, your communities, and your businesses chart a successful path toward a more resilient future. We encourage you to watch the previous episodes of the Resilience Advantage and stay tuned for the upcoming installations in this series. And we hope that you will join us in this growing resilience movement. Thank you.